Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, we enter camps for ISIL-linked detainees in Syria.
The threat doesn't seem to have gone away, and definitely there was a lot of fear with the fact that the US forces might withdraw.
As Syria attempts to unite after Assad, ISIL fighters remain isolated, incarcerated, and possibly primed for a comeback. I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take. A lot has happened in Syria over the past few months. The overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, whose family ruled the country for more than half a century. Now you have hundreds of thousands of Syrians flooding back into the cities of Damascus, Aleppo, and Homs. This is Syria's interim president, Ahmed al-Sharaa.
Just as Syria has liberated itself by itself, it is appropriate for it to build itself by itself.
But Northeast Syria is a world apart. That's where, more than a decade ago, in 2013, ISIL began seizing control.
The U.S. is ramping up efforts in the fight against ISIS. Secretary of Defense Ash Carter says we're sending more troops to Iraq and Syria.
The United States is carrying out its strongest attacks to date on ISIS targets. And this morning, reports from Syria say those airstrikes have stalled the ISIS assault on Kobani.
A Kurdish-Syrian Arab alliance of tens of thousands, the Syrian Democratic Forces, joined U.S. forces to fight back. And by March 2019, ISIL was officially driven out of Syria's northeast. But there was a question about what to do with the fighters. The countries where they were from no longer wanted to repatriate them, and camps were set up. They're effectively massive outdoor prisons.
The family members of ISIL fighters remain in al-Hol camp in northeastern Syria by the tens of thousands.
Al-Hol, one of the biggest camps, has been called the most dangerous place to be a child, and there are thousands of children. So, what's happening there now? To find out, we got a hold of Nils Adler, who spoke with a fighter in detention there. The fact that Bashar al-Assad was no longer president, it never came up.
My name is Nils Adler. I'm a journalist with Al Jazeera. I'm currently in Stockholm, Sweden, but I've just returned from Northeast Syria.
Okay, Nils, it's great to have you back on The Take. You've just returned from a reporting trip to a place very few reporters ever get to see, which is Northeast Syria.
Yeah, no, it was difficult. There was an enormous amount of permissions you needed to get to cross the border. So you needed, first of all, permissions from the Kurdish region of Iraq, 2 or 3 different authorities. And then once I was in Northeast Syria, there's an enormous amount of permissions I had to get on location. So speaking to various members of the internal security services.
It's been more than 5 years now. Wow, 5 years since ISIL was defeated there. Give us a sense of the place. Why is it so different from the rest of Syria, and why is it so difficult to access?
So Northeast Syria is run by Kurdish-led forces, and it's a semi-autonomous region within Syria. So, of course, Syria has been racked by a civil war and has been under heavy sanctions. But Northeast Syria, it's really, really cut off from the rest of the world. There's a lot of poverty. There's, a lot of facilities. There are problems with a lot of keeping the facilities running. And it's a really unusual place because you have a big, sprawling Russian base in the city-state Kamishli in the northeast. And so you kind of drive past these helicopters landing and the Russian flags. And then perhaps 5 minutes later, convoy of US troops passes you. So, it's a really unusual place to be.
So who's in charge?
It's the Kurdish-led authorities. The military that are in charge there are the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces. And of course, they're key US allies. But it's a kind of... it's a collection of different political parties in Northeast Syria. And they're semi-autonomous. So they divide responsibilities with Damascus and the authorities in Northeast Syria. But they are Kurdish-led.
So you visited and spoke to a prisoner from there, and you discovered that very little news has trickled into the prison. What did he have to say to you?
Yeah, so I met a Scandinavian prisoner, and he was part of ISIL. And he said that he'd had no information since 2019. So I assumed that they had heard about COVID because they had to take precautions in the prison. However, apart from that, he said he didn't know anything. 1 or 2 people had come to prison from Syria and Iraq and knew a little bit about the prices in those countries. but nothing else. And I asked him, is there one thing that you're really curious about? I wasn't allowed to tell him anything. But I said, if you could ask one thing, what would it be? And he said, who is the president of the United States of America?
And if he was stuck in 2019, he'd still think it was Trump, but then you'd have to tell him, well, there's been a president in between, which would blow his mind.
He had so many questions.
So what does the prison look like? What is the facility? How many people are there? Who's doing security?
Well, I wasn't actually allowed to enter the prison because of a security operation they said was taking place. So I met him in a secured location near to the prison, and he was brought in with a bag over his head and his hands tied. They removed the bag from his head, and we had to kind of get to know each other in that moment. And I spent about an hour and a half with him. But the conditions in the compound was okay. But of course, I was in 2 camps, which you could classify as detention centers as well for the families of ISIL fighters. And there, the conditions were really dire.
Yeah, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of these prisoners in this area. I think 65,000 is the number.
Yeah, there is an awful lot, and they're very much kind of forgotten by the world. And we've got to remember, many of them are Iraqi or Syrian. However, a vast amount of them, I don't have the exact numbers on me, but, are foreign fighters. So they come from all sorts of places, many from Europe, from Central Asia, Africa, the Caribbean. And then you have their families as well. So thousands of family members of these ISIL fighters in 2 camps in Northeast Syria.
Yeah, and just remind us why all of these foreign nationals came to this region in the first place.
So that's an interesting point. I think we always assumed, that they were attracted to, at least in the West, attracted to this gore and the violence that came with, the propaganda that ISIL propagated. And that might be the case for many of them, but I think for a lot of them, and speaking to people who did join ISIL, there were lots of different reasons. Some believed in the ideology. Some, I really do feel, just wanted to do something spectacular. It didn't matter if they were famous or infamous. They wanted to do something in their life that was, they would be remembered for.
And so you said, in addition to these prisons, you also have a facility where there's camps with men, women, and thousands of children. What do these facilities look like?
So there are 2 major camps. There's al-Hol and Roj. And al-Hol mainly houses women and children from Syria and Iraq. And there, the conditions are incredibly dire. Really, really bad. Mm-hmm. So, there's a smell of sewage everywhere. They have problems with sanitation. It's overcrowded. It was initially intended to hold about 10,000 people, but, now it varies, but there've been up to around 60,000 people in there. So, really squalid conditions. There's also a section of it called the Annex. Now, the Annex is, really, really intensely secured, and it's where families of foreign fighters are held. And Roj is smaller. It's a little bit cleaner, it's a little bit neater, and has a lot more of European and, people from Western countries.
I mean, are the kids going to school? Are they getting any education?
Yeah, so there are education facilities. Now, I spoke to quite a few people in al-Hol, and they said, there are education facilities provided by some NGOs, but it's incredibly dangerous in al-Hol. It has got better, but for a couple of years, it was considered one of the most dangerous places in the world for children to live in because they were exposed to so much violence. There were murders every week. This was between 2021 and 2022. And a lot of the parents said, education facilities exist, but I'm not sending my kids there. I'd rather they stay in our tents, and I choose safety over an education. But of course, that can work for a couple of years, but they're saying, now there's a trade-off. If they don't get some form of education, they're not going to have a life.
Nils, you mentioned many of these fighters are foreign nationals. Many of them are from Europe. So, Nils, you're back in Europe now. Of course, Europe has been on the receiving end of so many Syrian refugees in the past. Many of the people you've spoken to, though, are still considered fighters. So they and their families are stuck, right? They're finding it almost impossible to be repatriated, especially as Europe gets more conservative. Just had elections in Germany where there was a rightward drift there. And in Sweden, where you're based, it's also pretty conservative now. So I wonder how the shifting politics in Europe have changed the prospects of some of these stateless families, right? They're stateless. And I guess because they might be stuck there, how that is changing the prospects for Northeast Syria specifically.
Yes, it's a good point. So the Kurdish-led authorities, I think they feel very frustrated, and they have felt for many years, the fact that Western or other countries in general aren't taking back their citizens and have kind of dumped them with the responsibility of looking after them and housing them in prisons and in detention centers. And of course, as you said, in Europe, there's been this kind of lurch to the right. And I can say, being in Sweden now, that's happened here. There's a right-wing government in place. And they've basically closed off any repatriation possibilities. So before, they were repatriating some of the kids and the mothers, saying that they shouldn't be blamed for the crimes of their parents. But now it's pretty much they're giving them the cold shoulder. So it's strange because in one way, the people in the camps realize that it's less likely they're going to get back, especially if they're from European countries.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Did you get a sense of irony at all that it was really because of these Syrian refugees? It was one of the factors that created this kind of rightward drift in Europe. And now they're sort of washing their hands of this region. They're not taking back any more refugees. They're maybe stopping support. And it could actually lead to a new rise of ISIL.
Absolutely. And they're not taking responsibility for their own citizens. So, there are Swedes, there are Germans, there are Brits in these camps there. But, more importantly, there are British, German, Swedish, French children in these camps. And, a lot of this rightward shift has been, we're stopping migration and refugees coming, migrants and refugees coming to our countries, but they're not taking care of their own citizens. And, you cannot place blame on these children. And so, there is some irony there that they're not taking care of their own citizens. But on the other side, there's a new government in Damascus, and they feel, there's a new possibility for diplomatic channels to potentially be repatriated.
What's changing in Northeast Syria? That's after the break. Okay, Nils, on Tuesday, after holding a surprise meeting on Syria's national transition, the interim president, President Ahmed al-Sharaa, made a speech pledging to deliver a democratic political transition for Syria.
What we are experiencing today is an exceptional and rare historical opportunity in which we must use every moment to serve the interests of our people and our nation and honor the sacrifices of its children.
Now, there will be a conference upcoming where Syrians of all different backgrounds, they gather to dialogue. It's just starting the process of uniting Syria after more than a decade of civil war, which is going to be just a huge, huge challenge. I wonder what you made of the speech and if there are any challenges specifically for Northeast Syria, this region, that you'll be monitoring.
Yeah, so I think I wasn't surprised by al-Shara's speech. So the Kurdish-led authorities weren't invited to the table is quite telling. I think it doesn't mean that those channels aren't open in the future. I think the people I spoke to in Northeast Syria, including representatives from the government and the various, factions within that government, they varied from cautious optimism, saying, we could work with this government in Damascus. But others were, deeply suspicious and saying, I don't think anything's going to change. And in fact, one person said to me something that was very interesting. He said, our biggest fear is that we'll regret that Assad went. And to be honest, it was very difficult to get my head around, how this is going to work. But that's not necessarily to say that they can't work together.
Yeah, a big part of the challenge is monopoly on arms. Sharaa has said that the Kurdish forces should be integrated into the national army.
The unity of arms and its monopoly by the state is not a luxury, but a duty and an obligation. Syria does not accept division. It is an integrated whole, and its strength lies in its unity.
I wonder how that's going to play up there.
Yes, that's very interesting, and I can't say too much about that right now. I can say I spoke to one of the founding members of the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, and he said he was open, him and his comrades were open to potentially being part of an army, but when we get down to the small print, it's going to be really important how they flesh out those details.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to remember that this was the Kurdish forces and the U.S. were responsible for this victory. And now Donald Trump is talking about pulling military support back from this area. I mean, what are the direct consequences of the U.S. actually leaving this area?
And it could be huge. They've They've said a lot. I don't know whether it will happen. You could feel there was a US military presence. You could never officially go up and speak to any US troops, but you could see the convoys, and people in the region felt secure because US troops were there side by side with the Kurdish-led forces. I think a withdrawal won't just have an effect on the security situation in terms of how many troops and boots are on the ground protecting certain facilities and so forth, but also a sense of security. People feel the US troops were there and they were incredibly helpful, and they fought side by side with the SDF. And so there's both the actual physical sense of security that they provide, but also this sense that we have allies in the world. We're not recognized as a state. No one recognizes us, but we have the US forces on our side, and we have Turkey next door that they see as an enemy. So it would have a big impact.
When U.S. President Donald Trump came into office, he ended aid from the U.S. And in just the past few days, actually, USAID has cut 2,000 employees. How could this impact some of the people that you spoke to directly?
This could potentially have a huge impact. And I have to say, the US were incredibly popular. The people I spoke to, they felt that US forces had fought side by side with the SDF, the global coalition. And, they thought it is a big breach of trust. They trusted that the US would continue to support them. And I think in these detention centers, they're saying ISIL is still a threat. There are still ISIL sleeper cells within the camps. There are ISIL sleeper cells outside of the camps. If you withdraw this funding, there are going to be protests. The conditions are already bad as it is. If the funding is cut, and it was for a few days, temporary waivers have been given, but in the long term, no one knows whether USAID will withdraw all their money to really vital contractors like Bluemont. And they're saying there'll be protests and there'll be trouble, and the threat of ISIL isn't over, and this could really jeopardize the security of the region.
Yeah, I mean, the thing in the background of this conversation is, are we laying the groundwork for a resurgence of ISIL, right? And in some ways, the world has kind of moved on, and I'm thinking about this issue, but these guys are trapped in a different era. I mean, you think about those Japanese soldiers in the mountains who still think World War II is happening. I mean, because they haven't moved on, and because there's this security vacuum, I mean, is that why the people in the area are sounding the alarm that if they don't get the support they need, things could get really bad?
Absolutely. And I think, we're not there yet. There's still, everything is heavily militarized. There's a lot of checkpoints. We're not there yet, but we're really on the brink. So I spoke to some people in Hasaka, which is a city in Syria, and they invited me in, and I had tea with them, and I chatted to them, and they said, we have no job opportunities. Things are incredibly expensive. One of them ran a real estate company, and he hadn't sold anything or rented anything for a year. And he had a medical condition. There's no health infrastructure, he feels. And he said, if another group comes, be that ISIL, I would be open to it. I would prefer this area is controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces. However, I have no opportunities. And if another group can give me an opportunity in life, a job, something else, then I would be open to it. There's very few opportunities. There have been sanctions for many, many years. And people want to change. And if that's ISIL, then they're open to it.
So Nils, all of this is happening as the world is realigning, for lack of a better word, right? Trump is getting closer to Russia. There are talks in Saudi Arabia. An Arab League meeting is next week. Is what's happening in Northeast Syria something that will be discussed in some of these meetings?
It doesn't seem to be that way. I mean, Northeast Syria has lived in isolation. I mean, the whole of Syria has, of course, but especially Northeast Syria has lived very isolated from the rest of the world. It's not recognized by any other country. And now it hasn't been invited to the table in Damascus. I don't know what is going to happen. It's a very important area, especially if we're talking about the threat of ISIL. And I think a lot of people I spoke to said, we are an experiment. This has only existed for, a certain amount of years, just around about a decade. And we will continue this experiment. But this experiment, we don't really have many allies. We just have the US forces. I think they're prepared to live in isolation if needs be.
Yeah. Let's bring it full circle back to the prisoner that you traveled all this way to see. He didn't know about this new government in Syria. He didn't know about Trump. In some ways, he and his comrades are trapped in a different era, right? One where ISIL is still this kind of real force. Did you get the sense that the zeal of his convictions has increased or diminished over time?
I can say that he said he didn't regret anything that he'd done, but he did repent for certain things. I spoke to quite a few people who had been part of ISIL, and it's hard to gauge. I feel like there's definitely some of the ideology survives, and there's definitely a lot of people who still support the cause, as it were, and there's some support for ISIL in the area. But of course, this has been some really tough years in prison. And the other thing is, I have to, be fair to the people I interviewed. There are a lot of, eyes and ears on them. So everything they say, someone is listening, and it's really hard to gauge, in some ways when it talks about, do they still believe in stuff? Are they trying to protect themselves by saying certain things? So that's very, very hard to gauge, I think.
Well, that's why your reporting is so fascinating, because this seems like the most important area of the world that no one seems to know how to deal with or even want to talk about.
Exactly.
Thank you for coming on The Take.
Thank you very much.
And that's The Take. So much is changing around the world. We're curious about what's happening where you live. What are the issues you're concerned about? Let us know what else we should be covering here on The Take. We always read the comments, so let us know. We'll be back tomorrow.